From a tiny budget that forced designers to use motorcycle suits and Nazi helmets, to a paint job so black it disappeared on camera, Darth Vader's iconic armor had a surprisingly chaotic journey to the big screen. The actor inside couldn't see properly, broke lightsabers left and right, and spoke with an accent the crew nicknamed Darth Farmer, all while wearing a costume that was only supposed to appear in one scene. Here are 15 weird facts you didn't know about Darth Vader's suit from Star Wars 1977. Fact 1. Built on a shoestring 500 pounds budget. One of the most iconic villains in cinema history was built on an incredibly tight budget that seems almost impossible by today's standards. The entire Darth Vader costume for the original 1977 Star Wars film cost just 500 British pounds, which translates to roughly $1,173. To put that in perspective, modern blockbuster movies often spend tens of thousands of dollars just on a single costume for a major character, yet this legendary suit that would define sci-fi villainy for generations was created for barely more than $1,000. The story of how it came together is even more surprising. In January 1976, costume designer John Molo and wardrobe supervisor Ron Beck put together what they called a fashion show for George Lucas to help visualize what Vader might look like. They didn't have the time or money to build something from scratch, so they got creative with whatever they could find lying around the costume department. They dressed a model in a black motorcycle suit that happened to be available, found a Nazi helmet from the military costume section, grabbed a gas mask to create that menacing face covering, and topped it all off with a monk's cloak they discovered in the Middle Ages department. This bizarre combination of everyday items somehow worked perfectly to create the terrifying Dark Lord of the Sith. Lucas approved the direction they were heading, which gave Molo and his team the green light to move forward with actual construction. Even with Lucas's approval, the budget remained incredibly limited at just 500 pounds for the entire project. The team had to make a life cast of actor David Prowse to ensure the suit would fit his massive 6'6" frame properly, then sculpt, mold, and cast all the pieces using fiberglass. Every penny had to count, and somehow they managed to create a costume that would become one of the most recognizable images in film history without breaking the bank. Fact 2. The mask was only for one scene. Darth Vader's iconic breathing mask, one of the most recognizable elements of his entire look, was never supposed to be a permanent part of his character design. Concept artist Ralph McQuarrie created the mask with a very specific and practical purpose in mind for just a single scene in the movie. In the original script for Star Wars, the opening sequence showed Vader boarding a rebel ship from another vessel, which meant he would have to cross through the vacuum of space to get there. McQuarrie realized this presented a problem and asked George Lucas a simple question: how is Vader supposed to breathe out there in space? This practical concern led McQuarrie to design a breathing apparatus for Vader that featured a downward curving snout and big goggles, giving the character a way to survive in the airless environment. The mask was meant to be temporary, something Vader would wear only while moving between ships and then remove once he was safely inside with a breathable atmosphere. It was purely a functional piece of equipment for that one specific moment, not unlike how astronauts wear helmets during spacewalks, but take them off once they're back inside their spacecraft. However, when George Lucas saw McQuarrie's design with its skull-like appearance and menacing features, he had a completely different reaction than anyone expected. Instead of seeing it as a simple breathing device for one scene, Lucas fell in love with the entire look and made an immediate creative decision that would change the character forever. He decided that Vader would keep the mask on permanently throughout the entire film, transforming what was supposed to be a temporary breathing aid into the character's defining visual feature. This snap decision also became a crucial element of Vader's backstory, establishing that he needed the mask to survive at all times. McQuarrie himself later explained that he thought George felt keeping Vader always in his mask would be fascinating, like an actor in an old Greek tragedy, but it all came to pass simply because the artist thought the character needed a mask to breathe in that opening scene. Fact 3. Too black to see on screen. The production team thought they had nailed Darth Vader's look when they finished building the costume and gave it its first paint job, but they quickly discovered a major technical problem that threatened to ruin the entire visual impact of the character. Following the dark and menacing aesthetic from Ralph McQuarrie's concept paintings, the crew painted Vader's costume in an all-black color scheme that seemed perfect for the villainous Sith Lord. However, when they actually filmed test footage with the costume under the set's lighting conditions, they realized they had made a significant mistake that nobody had anticipated during the design phase. The costume was simply too black. The problem wasn't that it looked bad in person, but rather that the deep black color absorbed so much light that the camera couldn't pick up any of the suit's details or features when it was being filmed. All of the careful sculpting work, the intricate design elements, and the dimensional aspects of the armor completely disappeared on screen, turning Vader into essentially a flat black silhouette, without any visual depth or definition. The audience wouldn't be able to see the shape of his helmet, the details of his chest plate, or any of the elements that made the costume look intimidating and mechanical. It was a technical disaster that could have made one of cinema's greatest villains look like nothing more than a dark blob on film. The production team had to come up with a solution fast, and they decided to completely repaint key sections of the costume using a two-tone color scheme. They added gunmetal silver paint to the face mask and shoulder armor, creating a contrast between the glossy black and the metallic gray that would actually show up on camera. This combination of colors allowed the lighting to catch different surfaces and create the visual depth and definition that the costume desperately needed. The contrast between the two tones stopped the costume from washing out on screen and finalized the look that fans around the world have come to know and recognize instantly. Fact 4. Darth Farmer voice problem. David Prowse delivered all of Darth Vader's lines on set during filming, speaking through the mask in his natural voice while the cameras rolled. But there was one major problem that became immediately apparent to everyone on the production. Prowse was from Bristol, England, and he spoke with a strong West Country English accent, which is the kind of regional dialect that many people associate with farmers and rural countryside life rather than with intimidating galactic villains. His accent was so naturally friendly and cheerful sounding that it completely clashed with the menacing, evil character he was supposed to be portraying in the heavy black armor. The mismatch between the terrifying visual appearance of Darth Vader and Prowse's jovial-sounding voice became a running joke among the cast and crew during production. Actress Carrie Fisher, who played Princess Leia, later revealed in a documentary that the people working on set came up with a hilarious nickname for Prowse because of his accent. They started calling him Darth Farmer instead of Darth Vader, poking fun at how his rural English accent made him sound more like someone who should be working in the countryside than serving as the Dark Lord of the Sith. The nickname stuck throughout filming and became a lighthearted way for the cast and crew to acknowledge that while Prowse looked perfect for the role physically, his voice simply didn't match the character that George Lucas had envisioned. Lucas knew that Vader needed a much darker and more threatening voice to make the character work properly on screen. The director wanted something deeper and more sinister that would match the imposing visual presence of the costume and create genuine fear in the audience. This led Lucas to make the decision to have the entire voice performance redubbed in post-production by James Earl Jones, whose deep, resonant voice transformed Vader into the terrifying villain that audiences remember today. While Prowse's physical performance brought Vader to life on set, it was Jones's voice that ultimately made the character truly menacing. Fact 5. Prowse didn't know about the voice change. David Prowse spent months on the set of Star Wars performing as Darth Vader, speaking all of his lines through the mask and believing that his voice would be the one audiences would hear when the film was released. Throughout the entire filming process, nobody from the production team told him that his performance was only temporary or that George Lucas had different plans for the character's final voice. Prowse had been informed that his lines would need to be re-recorded because the audio quality wasn't good enough due to the muffled sound of speaking through the mask, which was a perfectly reasonable explanation that made complete sense to him. What Prowse didn't know was that the plan was never to bring him back to re-record those lines himself. Instead, Lucas had already decided to use a completely different actor with a more intimidating voice to replace Prowse's West Country accent with something that would sound appropriately menacing for the Dark Lord of the Sith. The production kept this decision quiet, and Prowse continued working on the film under the assumption that he would eventually get called into a recording studio to properly dub his own dialogue once filming wrapped up. The shocking truth came as a complete surprise to Prowse on what should have been one of the most exciting nights of his career. When he attended the opening night premiere of Star Wars and watched the film for the very first time alongside the audience, he heard James Earl Jones's deep, powerful voice coming out of Darth Vader's mask instead of his own. That moment in the theater was when Prowse discovered that his voice had been entirely replaced without anyone telling him beforehand. He later confirmed in interviews that he had been completely unaware of the voice substitution until he actually saw the finished movie, making the premiere a bittersweet experience where he got to see his physical performance on the big screen but heard a stranger's voice coming from his character. Fact 6. The lightsaber, breaking bodybuilder. David Prowse's impressive physical stature made him perfect for bringing Darth Vader's imposing presence to life on screen, but his background as a bodybuilder rather than a trained actor created some unexpected problems during production. Prowse had no experience with sword fighting or stage combat, and this lack of skill became painfully obvious when it came time to film the lightsaber duel scenes between Vader and Luke Skywalker. The props department had created lightweight staffs to stand in for the glowing energy blades that would be added later through special effects, but these staffs weren't designed to withstand the kind of force that Prowse was putting behind his swings. The problem was that Prowse simply didn't know how to control his strength or use proper fencing techniques during the choreographed fight sequences. Instead of executing the careful, controlled movements that stage combat requires, he would swing the prop staffs with far too much power and hit them together with excessive force. This resulted in Prowse repeatedly breaking the lightsaber props during rehearsals and takes, creating delays and frustration for the production team who had to keep replacing the damaged equipment. His inability to handle the weapons properly made it clear that he wasn't going to be able to perform the increasingly complex lightsaber battles that were planned for the sequels. When it came time to make The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, the production team made the decision to bring in professional help for all of the fight scenes. They hired Bob Anderson, an Olympic fencing champion and experienced stunt coordinator who also served as the fight choreographer for the films. Anderson took over the role of Darth Vader whenever lightsabers were involved, performing all of the intricate dueling sequences that required actual sword fighting skill. To compensate for the height difference between Anderson and Prowse, the filmmakers used creative camera angles and had Anderson wear platform shoes to make him appear taller and maintain the illusion that it was still the same imposing Vader in every scene. Fact 7. Only one suit made. Modern big-budget film productions typically create multiple copies of important costumes in case something gets damaged or needs to be cleaned during the lengthy filming process, but the original Star Wars production didn't have that luxury due to their extremely limited budget and resources. Costume designer John Mollo made just a single Darth Vader suit for the entire production of the film, which meant that if anything happened to damage or destroy that one costume, there would be no backup available and filming would have to stop while they built a replacement from scratch. This put enormous pressure on everyone involved to take exceptional care of the costume throughout the shoot. The process of creating even that one suit required careful planning and precise measurements to ensure it would actually fit the actor who would be wearing it for months during production. David Prowse stood 6 feet 6 inches tall and had the muscular, powerful build of a professional bodybuilder, which meant the costume couldn't just be made in a standard size or adjusted on the fly like regular clothing. To solve this challenge, the costume team created a life cast of Prowse's entire body, which is essentially a detailed mold that captures every contour and measurement of a person's physical form. This life cast allowed them to sculpt and build the armor pieces directly based on Prowse's actual dimensions, ensuring that every component would fit his hulking frame properly. The construction process involved sculpting the facial mask and other pieces over the life cast using clay, then creating plaster molds from those sculptures, and finally casting the actual costume pieces in fiberglass. Artist Brian Muir was responsible for sculpting the iconic helmet that would become one of the most recognizable props in film history. The entire process was time-consuming and expensive relative to the tight budget they were working with, which explains why creating multiple suits simply wasn't feasible for the production team. Fact 8. Inspired by WWI German armor. While concept artist Ralph McQuarrie had drawn inspiration from sources like Bedouin robes and Japanese samurai armor when creating his initial designs for Darth Vader, costume designer John Mollo brought a completely different historical perspective to the character when he joined the production. Mollo was an expert in military uniforms and historical combat gear, and when he looked at McQuarrie's artwork, his mind immediately went to a very specific period of military history that would add an unexpected layer of menace to the villain's appearance. Mollo saw striking similarities between the armor pieces in McQuarrie's concept art and the protective equipment worn by German soldiers during the First World War. The trench warfare of World War I had required specialized armor to protect soldiers from shrapnel and other hazards in the brutal conditions of the battlefield, and these metal plates and protective gear had a distinctive, heavy, industrial look that matched the intimidating quality Lucas wanted for his villain. The connections Mollo drew weren't just about the body armor either. as he also noticed that Vader's helmet bore a strong resemblance to the Stahlhelm, which was the distinctive steel combat helmet used by German forces that had become an iconic symbol of military power and aggression. These historical references were entirely intentional on Malo's part, as he used his expertise in military costume design to ground Vader's sci-fi appearance in real-world visual language that audiences would subconsciously recognize as threatening and authoritarian. The influence of German military design helped create an immediate association in viewers' minds between Vader and militaristic oppression, even if they couldn't consciously identify exactly why the costume felt so menacing. This blending of futuristic science fiction elements with historical military aesthetics became one of the key factors that made Vader's design so effective and memorable, creating a villain who felt both otherworldly and grounded in a familiar visual language of power and intimidation. Fact 9. Helmet visibility was terrible. The original Darth Vader helmet looked absolutely menacing on camera, but wearing it was a completely different story for the actor trapped inside. David Prowse had serious difficulty seeing through the helmet's small eyepieces during the filming of the first Star Wars movie, which created safety concerns and made it harder for him to hit his marks and perform his scenes effectively. The limited visibility wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it was a genuine problem that affected his ability to move around the set safely and interact with other actors during filming. The design issues became even more apparent when combined with other practical problems with the helmet. The domed top piece wasn't secured as well as it should have been, which meant it could shift around during movement and make the already difficult visibility situation even worse. Additionally, Prowse struggled to breathe properly inside the confined space of the helmet, as the ventilation simply wasn't adequate for someone wearing the costume for extended periods under hot studio lights. When the production team began working on The Empire Strikes Back, they knew they needed to address these problems before putting Prowse back in the costume for another lengthy shoot. The designers made several modifications to improve the helmet's functionality, including changes to make the domed top fit more securely so it wouldn't move around during action sequences. They also enlarged the triangular chin vent, which gave Prowse better airflow for breathing and slightly improved his ability to see what was happening around him on set. The visibility problem became even more critical when stunt performer Bob Anderson took over for the lightsaber fighting sequences, since he needed to see well enough to execute complex choreographed sword fights without injuring himself or his scene partners. To solve this issue, the production team created a completely separate helmet, specifically for Anderson, made from tinted acrylic material. This special stunt helmet allowed much more light to pass through than just the small eyepieces, giving Anderson the visibility he needed to safely perform the demanding fight scenes. Fact 10. James Earl Jones took just 2.5 hours. One of the most iconic voices in cinema history was recorded in a remarkably short amount of time that seems almost impossible given the massive cultural impact it would eventually have. James Earl Jones completed all of his voice work for Darth Vader in the original Star Wars film in just 2.5 hours inside a recording booth, delivering every single line of dialogue that would help define one of the greatest villains in movie history in less time than it takes to watch the film itself. The brevity of the recording session stands in stark contrast to the legendary status the performance would achieve over the following decades. What makes this even more surprising is how Jones himself viewed the work at the time he was doing it. He didn't see his contribution as a major acting performance or a significant role in the film, but rather thought of it as simply providing special effects for the production. In his mind, he was just adding a technical element to help complete the character, similar to how sound designers might add other audio effects to enhance the movie. This humble perspective on his own work showed that Jones had no idea his voice would become so instantly recognizable and influential in popular culture. The payment Jones received for this quick recording session reflected his own assessment of the work as a minor contribution rather than a starring role. He was paid $7,500 for those 2.5 hours in the booth, which wasn't a particularly large sum even by 1970s standards for a film production, especially considering the actor's established reputation and talent. The modest payment made sense given that Jones viewed it as a small technical job rather than a major performance, and nobody involved in the production could have predicted that this brief recording session would help create a character whose voice would be quoted, imitated, and instantly recognized by audiences around the world for generations to come. Fact 11. The breathing sound is trademarked. Darth Vader's mechanical breathing sound is so distinctive and culturally significant that Lucasfilm took the unusual step of registering it as an official trademark with the United States Patent and Trademark Office, where it's legally protected under trademark number 774192252. This means that if anyone wants to use that specific sound effect in their own movies, television shows, or other media projects, they need to get permission from Lucasfilm first, just like they would if they wanted to use a company's logo or brand name. The legal protection extends beyond just the Star Wars films themselves and covers any commercial use of that iconic breathing sound. The creation of this legendary sound effect came from the creative genius of Ben Burtt, who served as the sound designer for the original Star Wars film and faced the challenging task of making Vader sound both mechanical and menacing. Burtt experimented with different approaches and equipment before finding the perfect solution in a piece of scuba diving gear. He recorded himself breathing through a scuba regulator, which is the device that divers use to breathe underwater from their air tanks, and discovered that the mechanical nature of the regulator created exactly the kind of ominous, rhythmic breathing sound that the character needed. The regulator's valves opening and closing produced that distinctive two-part sound pattern that audiences instantly recognize. Burtt then carefully synchronized these breathing sounds with James Earl Jones's vocal performance to create the complete audio package for the character. The breathing effect plays constantly throughout Vader's scenes, even when he's speaking, which creates the impression that this is a man who's completely dependent on mechanical life support systems to survive. The trademark registration of this single sound effect demonstrates just how valuable and recognizable certain audio elements can become in popular culture, reaching a level of iconic status where they need the same kind of legal protection that companies give to their visual logos and brand names. Fact 12. Jones requested no credit. James Earl Jones made an unusual decision when he completed his voice work for the original Star Wars film that would seem completely backwards by Hollywood standards. Rather than insisting his name appear prominently in the credits like most actors would, Jones specifically asked the filmmakers not to include his name in the credits at all when the movie was released. This meant that when audiences watched Star Wars in 1977 and heard that powerful, intimidating voice coming from Darth Vader's mask, they had no way of knowing from the credits that it belonged to James Earl Jones, who was already a respected and established actor at that time. Jones's reasoning behind this request stemmed from his humble view of his own contribution to the film. He genuinely believed that his voice work was such a small and technical part of the overall production that it didn't warrant receiving screen credit alongside the other actors who had physically appeared on camera and performed in their roles throughout the lengthy filming process. In his mind, he had simply spent a couple of hours providing what amounted to a special effect for the movie, and that didn't seem significant enough to justify having his name listed in the credits. This perspective shows a remarkable level of modesty, especially considering that his voice would become one of the most recognizable elements of the entire character. The filmmakers honored Jones's request and left his name out of the credits for the first Star Wars film, and this arrangement continued through The Empire Strikes Back as well. It wasn't until Return of the Jedi, the third film in the original trilogy, that James Earl Jones finally received official credit for his work as the voice of Darth Vader. By that point, his contribution had become such an integral and celebrated part of the character that it made sense to acknowledge it publicly, even though Jones himself had never sought that recognition in the first place. Fact 13. Modern suits need cooling systems. When Hayden Christensen returned to play Darth Vader for the Obi-Wan Kenobi series on Disney Plus in 2022, the production team had learned valuable lessons from decades of actors suffering in heavy costumes under hot studio lights. The Vader suit that Christensen wore incorporated modern technology that would have seemed like science fiction to the crew working on the original 1970s films, including a sophisticated cooling system built right into the costume itself to keep the actor from overheating during the demanding production schedule. The suit featured a special underlayer that contained liquid cooling technology, similar to what astronauts or race car drivers might use in their protective gear. This hidden layer sat between Christensen's body and the outer armor pieces, running throughout the costume to help regulate his body temperature while he was sealed inside the heavy black outfit. The real innovation came in how the system worked during breaks in filming, when Christensen would sit down and connect himself to an external device that would circulate the cooling liquid through the tubes in his underlayer, actively pulling heat away from his body and bringing his temperature back down to a comfortable level. Christensen himself talked about how the costume was incredibly hot and heavy to wear, making the cooling system absolutely essential for his comfort and safety on set. In interviews, he explained that between takes he would get plugged into this circulation device while still wearing the full costume, which allowed him to cool down without having to go through the lengthy process of removing and then reapplying all the armor pieces. He also mentioned an interesting side effect of needing this mechanical assistance, noting that the requirement to physically plug himself into a machine to function properly actually made him feel even more connected to his character, since Darth Vader himself depends on mechanical systems for his survival. Fact 14. Christensen's extreme weight gain. Hayden Christensen faced a significant physical challenge when he signed on to reprise his role as Darth Vader for the Obi-Wan Kenobi series, and it had nothing to do with learning fight choreography or delivering dramatic performances. The problem was simple but daunting. He needed to physically fill out the imposing Darth Vader suit in a way that would look convincing on screen, which meant adding a substantial amount of mass to his naturally lean frame. Christensen stands 6 feet 1 inch tall and normally weighs around 160 pounds, but the original Vader suit had been designed to fit David Prowse, a professional bodybuilder who was 6 feet 6 inches tall and weighed nearly 200 pounds. To solve this problem, Christensen embarked on an intensive 9-month process of consuming as many calories as possible to pack on between 25 and 30 pounds of additional weight. This wasn't a quick or easy transformation, as he had to maintain a strict eating regimen for the better part of a year to gradually build up the muscle mass and bulk needed to make the costume look right. In interviews, Christensen explained that this physical transformation process was actually very important to him, because he needed to become that character again, not just mentally but physically as well, reconnecting with Vader through the demanding preparation work. The dedication Christensen showed in bulking up for the role made the final product look authentic and powerful on screen, but maintaining that extra weight proved to be unsustainable once filming wrapped up. He admitted with a laugh that while he tried to avoid developing what he called a dad bod and attempted to maintain his Vader body after production finished, he pretty much just went back to his old diet once the work was done. The result was that he deflated back to his normal size relatively quickly, losing all that hard-earned mass in a much shorter time than it had taken to gain it in the first place. Fact 15. The helmet resembles a skull. The terrifying appearance of Darth Vader's helmet wasn't just a happy accident of the design process, but rather a carefully planned artistic choice that concept artist Ralph McQuarrie made to create a specific psychological effect on audiences. McQuarrie deliberately designed the mask to resemble a human skull, tapping into one of the most primal and universal symbols of death and mortality that exists across virtually every culture in the world. This intentional connection to death imagery helped establish Vader as a character who represented something far more sinister than just another military villain or enemy soldier. The skull-like qualities of the mask can be seen in several key design elements that McQuarrie incorporated into his artwork. The dark eye sockets of the helmet mirror the empty eye cavities of a skull, creating an unsettling, hollow appearance that suggests something inhuman lurking beneath the surface. The general shape and proportions of the face mask echo the structure of a human skull, with the dome of the helmet representing the cranium and the facial features arranged in a way that triggers subconscious recognition of skeletal anatomy. Even the triangular shape of the breathing apparatus on the lower part of the mask can evoke associations with the nasal cavity of a skull when viewed from certain angles. This death-related symbolism worked on multiple levels to enhance the character's impact. On a visual level, it made Vader instantly recognizable as a threat and an embodiment of danger, since humans have evolved to react with caution and fear when confronted with symbols of death. On a storytelling level, the skull-like appearance reinforced the idea that Anakin Skywalker had essentially died and been replaced by this mechanical creature, with the mask serving as a kind of death's head that represented the destruction of his former identity. McQuarrie's decision to build these associations into the design helped create a villain whose appearance alone could communicate volumes about his nature and role in the story.